Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, and normally I introduce myself as the game master, but I was not the GM this time. The GM for this one was a friend of mine named Dr. Jake. Jake and I have been friends since 1999, back when I owned the local comic book store, and he was one of my regular customers. Um, we thought that Jake would be perfect for running this adventure for a multitude of reasons. One is that he's an actual doctor. And so part of that is that he has to be very professional, very courteous, very respectful, just all the time, right? And he deals with people from all walks of life, and he gets along with all of them. And we thought that was important. Um, the other thing is that his parents were born in the Middle East. So for us to run an adventure that takes place there, we want to get it right. We want to cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's. We just want to make sure everything is as perfect as it can be. And Jake is an atheist now, but that wasn't the case when he was growing up. His parents were actually very religious, right? And they were very, very interested in Jake memorizing um their script. I don't think scriptures is the right word there, but you know what I mean, right? The texts. So he would devote all that stuff to memory. And so now to this day, he is just sharp as a whip at, if you ask about something like dietary restrictions or anything about that belief system, Jake is like Google, where he can just tell you, right? And then even when it comes to the little things of running an adventure, like, well, what is the food like? I have never been to the Middle East. Jake has been there like a million times, right? He still has family over there. He has cousins and stuff. So he goes over every once in a while. I don't know exactly how often. I don't know if it's every other year or what, but he's been over there plenty of times. And so then he was also the right man for the job when it comes to, if you want a bite to eat, here's where you go, here's what you find. And part of it too is like if you go to this place and you ask for a certain thing, you might make this person mad, right? He was just the best at all that stuff. And so this adventure that had such tremendous potential to go wrong did not. It was beautifully done. Um, which I suppose then raises the question, why did we even go there, right? And so for me to introduce that idea, I need to talk about, of all things, the fires in Los Angeles. Um, First of all, to be very clear, as a kid, I loved LA. I would watch TV shows. It was all the shows with like they were kind of famous for a certain vehicle. So like Knight Rider, the A Team, Automan, a lot of those Glenn Larson shows were filmed in or around LA. I assume it was just cheaper. I think that's where, everybody who worked on the show lived there. So they, it was just way easier to film it there than it was to go somewhere else on location and, so on and so forth. But because of that, I had this kind of romanticized, sort of glamorous kind of way of thinking of the West Coast. You know what I mean? And and then even when I got older, I've said this before on the podcast, I'm a huge Transformers fan. And I remember my very first day on Facebook ever. Uh, and I remember the first time I sent a friend request, I put in my DVD of Transformers the movie and I went to the credits at the end of the movie and paused the screen, and I started sending a friend request to every single name in those credits. And one of those people was Paul Eiding, who was the voice of Perceptor from G1 Transformers. Perceptor was like a nerdy microscope guy. Um, Metal Gear fans would know Paul Eiding as the Colonel. Fans of Ben 10 would perhaps know him as Grandpa Max. But at any rate, he has had a long and storied career. He's very accomplished and he's a super nice guy. And so we became very good friends. And back then is when they found my brain tumor, which, by the way, for this is going to come into play in this adventure. It makes me very forgetful. I struggle with terminology. I forget words. This week, and I don't mean difficult words. Literally, this week at one point, I forgot the word green. And it's not like I don't know what green is. My day job these days is I'm an art teacher, right? I know what green is. I could not think of the word for the life of me, right? Um, so that's going to come up because there's a lot of like terminology and there's a lot of specific ideas um in this game because it deals with other cultures and stuff like that. I'm going to fumble with the terminology. Try to bear with me, right? I'm doing my best. But so that said, when they first found the brain tumor, they thought I had 6 months to live. So I'd put a thing about that on Facebook, and then Paul Eiding had reacted to that very strongly, and he was following my journey, more than most of those other guys were. And so I would have these days where I'd have to go someplace and get an MRI, and there was kind of it's kind of, at least to me, it's funny, you know, is I had to take X-rays with me of my head and I left them in the car. And so I have to go through this hospital in a big city and I've never been there before. And it's such a long walk up to the doctor's office. And I get there and they ask for the X-rays. And I go back down and I go to the car and I forget why I went there. You ever go into like a room in your house and you're like, what am I doing again? I, in particular, am very bad at that because of the brain tumor thing. So I go out to the car and I'm like, what? And I kept going back and forth until I finally got it right. And I put the story on Facebook, and Paul Eiding thought it was like really, really funny. And so he was like, you need to move out here. Like, you need to try to take what you do through your writing or your sense of humor or whatever. And he's like, move out here, live where I live. He's like, I will help you find work. Like, we will make this happen. Let's get you in the entertainment industry. And the other thing happening back then, by the way, was I entered a voice acting contest. That was the very, very, very first version of this channel. Was I had to record my voice to do impressions of certain characters. And I think the demo reel had to be something like 20 fictional characters. And then they picked a certain number, they'd pick something like, 64 people or whatever. And then they went on to the next round and then they would assign you characters to do. And it was really more impressions than anything. But the point is, I was pretty good at the lower range stuff like Darth Vader from Star Wars and Destro from G.I. Joe and stuff like that. So I actually took fourth place in this contest. And the three people that were in front of me were already professional voice actors. And then a couple of people behind me were professional voice actors. So that was another thing that all that was on Facebook. And Paul Eiding was like, you need to move to LA, man. And he also extended that invitation to a mutual friend of mine on Facebook named John Bailey Crumpton, who was another Transformers fan. And by the way, he is now the voice of Transformers in the Transformers movies. He was in the last movie they did, which was called Transformers 1. He was in the Bumblebee movie. Um, so I'm pretty jealous of him. And I remember asking my wife if we could move to LA, and she said no. That would not make her comfortable. So of course, I put my family first, and that's why I wasn't living in LA. But I have a ton of friends out there and then these fires hit, right? And so I don't want to say anything that makes you think that those fires were anything less than a tragedy. Uh, I was heartbroken about all of that. And there were moments where I was seeing places that I had always dreamed of living there, and you would just see there's nothing left, you know? And so as I'm watching all of this stuff, and obviously all the real world stuff comes first, right? But as I'm watching all of this, and like I start to hear people talking about they're going to rebuild it, it's going to be a smart city. I'm a little fuzzy on what that means, but I'm wondering then, so in my game world, 10 years from now, is LA going to be a smart city? And are those fires, is that going to be this big moment in history like the Great Fire in Chicago from back in the day? Um, and like, where were the heroes? Should I run a game where it's something like the Beyonder shows up and just takes all of Earth's heroes to another galaxy and they go do a Secret Wars type event or something along those lines? And that's why nobody put out the fire. You know what I mean? Like, I felt like no matter how you look at it, really, I needed addressed somehow, even if the way you address it is to ignore it, you're still somehow dealing with it, right? And I put a bunch of stuff on social media about it. I mentioned it in one of my videos here on the podcast. And the feedback, the majority was saying to address it. That when there's something going on in the real world, that you could include it in the game. So that then made us look at the timeline and we're like, okay, so where are we at in the timeline? And we realized we'd gotten to the Florida hurricane. And this is another thing. If you follow the podcast, you may remember my family and I were in it. We hardly ever go on vacation. And I'll make this one really quick. My wife has a bad spine. And when the plane landed in Orlando, it kind of hit the brakes. So it's not zipping down the runway at hundreds of miles an hour or whatever, right? So when it slams on the brakes and it pushed everybody forward against their seatbelt, that actually caused further damage to her spine. We're kind of just now finding out. She's been hurting extra bad ever since that trip. And we're just now kind of finding out why. So the sad thing is, I don't think my wife will ever be allowed to be on a plane ever again. And that breaks her heart because she had all these places in Europe she wanted to see one day. It sounds like that is not going to happen now. But at any rate, that's beyond the scope of the podcast. But so we went down to Florida. We never go on vacation. We finally did, and a hurricane hit. Yeah, which that is exactly my family's luck. You know what I mean? So we decided to include it in the game, that we should do an adventure that kind of addresses that. And so the prologue and the epilogue of this adventure are about the hurricane. And then the main body, the main chunk of the story, then becomes about all the stuff that we've probably all seen in the news about what's going on in the Middle East, right? And the idea we had for that was that Wonder Woman, if you think back to her origin story, where Steve Trevor ends up on, in the pre-crisis, they called it Paradise Island. That's kind of what I grew up with. Post-crisis, they refer to it as Themyscira. In our game, we say it's the same thing, just different names for the same thing. That's where Steve Trevor ends up. The Amazons nurse him back to health. Diana is chosen to become Wonder Woman. She takes him to the United States. And something they say a lot in almost every single continuity is she is supposed to be their ambassador of peace to the world of men. That is almost always the phrasing, right? And so we kind of realized we're like, you know what? We don't do a lot with Diana being an ambassador. Maybe we should, you know? And so we decided that with everything going on in the Middle East, that seemed like a logical fit, right? And I'm glad that we had Dr. Jake run it because he knew so much more about the situation than I did. Um, well, I'm instead of telling you about it even more, because God knows I'm being long-winded with this one. Um, let's just do the game itself and I'll let it unfold that way. So the prologue starts in Florida and the hurricane is coming, so the Justice League is here. And by the way, we broke the Justice League down based on basically how many APs of damage do people do. So we divided them up into two teams. So think of it as the captain of the one team with the higher numbers is Superman because he's got a strength of 50, right? The captain of the other team is Batman and he has a strength of 5. So on Batman's group, you're going to get characters like Black Canary, Green Arrow, the Ted Cord version of Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, guys like that, right? They're kind of on the low end of the spectrum in terms of how much damage they actually can inflict, right? And then you have the heavy hitters. So it's characters like Steel, Martian Manhunter, Maxima, Captain Atom, Captain Marvel, and I mean Billy Batson. I'm not referring to Carol Danvers. Um, you get the idea, right? The heavy hitters of the Justice League. We send them down to Florida because we're thinking on our end, whether it was, I grew up watching Super Friends and a member of the Super Friends would have to stop a volcano from erupting. Or there's plenty of times I've seen Superman versus a tornado where he flies around in the tornado going the opposite direction of the way the tornado is going and it disperses it. So because of kind of growing up on all that stuff, we thought, yeah, man, like this totally seems like a job for the Justice League. So we had Green Lanterns out on the beach, and they all create a sort of a rectangular glowing green neon wall in front of them that is meant to block this wind. And then you got characters like the Flash, and he's literally running around at the speed of light, evacuating people. Um, and then the Superman family, they also have super speed, so they too are doing this. And this was the first game we have ever ran where Superman did not have a secret identity. So as he's saving people, they're referring to him as Clarke and stuff like that. And it's like super weird for him, right? Um, and that's all because in a recent game we ran, Lara Kent is running for the presidency, which that was a riff off of the Earth H game we ran where Clark Kent Jr., Clark Kent II, who was the post-crisis Superman for us, he was running for the presidency on Earth H. We couldn't use him on Earth K because of Doomsday, but his sister's alive. And so she is now running for president, right? And so her mild-mannered alter ego that wears kind of like a women's business suit kind of a thing, that suit was destroyed by a rocket launcher. And when the smoke literally cleared, the crowd could see that underneath that outfit, she had been wearing a super suit. And by the way, we use the stats from first edition DC Heroes, where it is not immune to harm, but it is very resistant to harm. And it can certainly take that level of damage, right? So the secret was out, and the whole world suddenly realized that the Kent family is the Superman family, right? And so now we're seeing the fallout from that, and we're seeing the public interact with the Kent family. We're seeing the Kent family interact with the Kent family, which was interesting. And then we're seeing various members of the Kent family express the need to create a new identity, that they can't live like this. And so one of them was John Kent. And we haven't mentioned him much. In DC Comics, the actual comic books that are currently being published, my understanding is he's a pretty big deal. That I think he's their Superman now. I think he took his father's place. He's the son of Lois and Clarke. Um, he was a kid. He was, as I understand it, he was abducted by Superman's evil twin from Earth 3, which is called Ultraman, who abused him and like really messed him up. And so the character is darker because of that, you know. And I am not into that myself. I don't like the dark stuff with the Superman family at all. So that did not happen on our Earth. We're saying he's had a pretty good life. We also connect him to an old comic book called Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. In that, in the epilogue of that story, it takes place in 1997, and Lois and Clarke have a baby that is named John. So we're saying this is the same guy, right? This is that same baby from 1997. And in that story, the last name used is Elliot. So we sort of pay that lip service in this one, where our John Kent is talking about changing his name, you know, so that he can still have a secret identity. And then Lara, who's the one running for president, she does not want to do the secret identity thing. She's talking about maybe I just do it like this, you know, maybe I'm done with secret identities. So that was all very interesting. And the one character who's a heavy hitter, who was conspicuously missing from the hurricane stuff, which by the way, the Justice League had like no idea how they're going to stop a hurricane. I mean, the players, and that was cool. That was cool for them to do puzzle solving stuff, right? But at any rate, Wonder Woman is not there. And if you've been following the channel, you may remember that we destroyed Paradise Island a while back. And we also destroyed Asgard. We ran a game that was set when the first appearance of Darkseid took place in the real world. I don't have that date in front of me right now. I want to say it was like roughly 1970, give or take a year. Something like that, right? Um, but we had ran this game that was an homage to Jack Kirby. And we pitted kind of his DC characters against his Marvel characters, right? And we used the stats in the actual first edition DC Heroes RPG by Mayfair Games and the Marvel Superheroes RPG by TSR, also known as Phase Rip. We used those stats. I didn't change a single thing. And Darkseid won. Darkseid actually killed Thor and destroyed Asgard. And in fact, he killed almost all of the men. And we went the route at the time, and we played this a long time ago. I've been told since then that this is probably not how Vikings would do things. In my defense, I would argue that the Asgardians are not actually Vikings, though, either. They are people who encountered the Vikings on Earth, right? And they would be more alien than that, maybe. But either way, the thing we went with was that the female characters like Sif and the Enchantress and stuff like that were grabbing the kids and fleeing to Earth. And so one of these kids that was a baby at the time is an actual Marvel character named Torunn Thorsdóttir. And they spell Thorsdóttir like I want to say the end of it is like Dottir, maybe. I don't know. But at any rate, that's one of those things where I have to Google it before every time I write it down because I'm so unfamiliar with the spelling. But at any rate, so she was a baby and she was the daughter of Sif and Thor. Um, but Asgard is destroyed by the forces of Apocalypse all the way back then, right? And so that kind of raised questions about like, well, where do the Asgardians live now? And so on and so forth. And the other question was with regarding the Amazons was, well, hold on, because like I've mentioned a couple times, Amazons going in and out of the Bermuda Triangle, which is where Paradise Island used to be. It was in the middle of this area where there's this stuff called the Mists of Eternal Youth. And I've mentioned the mists in more recent games and stuff like that. And so there were people wondering, like, well, hold up, like, where do they live? So we decided to take both groups. And I thought that was kind of cool to have one from each world. One's DC stuff, one's Marvel stuff. Um, and we put them on the island of Avalon. And we moved Avalon to where Paradise Island used to be. And I thought that was a perfect fit because the more you research the Arthurian stories about Avalon, which first of all, I liked Avalon because it's neutral. It's not specific to DC or Marvel. So I liked that it was kind of neutral ground instead of the Amazons go to Asgard or the Asgardians go to Paradise Island. And I feel like somebody is a guest. I didn't want it to feel that way. I wanted it to feel very equal and very even. But we put them all on the same island then. And the more you know about Avalon, the more that's like a perfect fit because it was known for things like eternal youth and so on and so forth. And so it's good for the Amazons in that level. And then they had apples associated with eternal youth as well. And it was Avalon, I think, originally meant the Isle of Apples, which is a name that comes up a lot in all sorts of different mythologies. So that's interesting. But I I liked that then because with the Norse stuff, they had golden apples that sort of did that same thing and they were associated with Asgard. So I thought, man, this is just it's sort of firing on all cylinders. You know what I mean? I thought it was just a great fit. So we established that both groups are living on this island. And we come up with this idea that this hurricane is going to hit Florida hard and it's going to come north. And a lot of the old maps that DC used for Paradise Island did suggest that it was in the Atlantic Ocean, like north of Florida, south of New York, and obviously east of the United States, right? In the Bermuda Triangle. And so we thought, yeah, it would make sense for the hurricane to go up that way. This is a really good time for the Amazons to leave. And if Wonder Woman is an ambassador and all this stuff is happening in the Middle East, we're like, this is perfect. This is like Tetris pieces falling into place just the way you want them to. So we sent, and by now she is Queen Diana. We've actually to this day never said what happened to Hippolyta, I don't think. But we have said that Diana's queen, and we kind of just did that because it's been so long since her first appearance in 1941, and they have killed off Hippolyta a bunch of times in the comics and stuff like that, and they've had Diana take over. And I guess that's just I always am the kind of person that like if I'm watching Star Trek and I see somebody with like a lower rank, I assume that if we are going to tell a story about that character later in time, they will eventually be captain. You know what I mean? I just kind of assume that's the progression. So anytime I see someone who's like a prince or a princess or whatever, I'm always just assuming they're on their way to becoming a king or a queen. So because of that, we made Diana Queen Diana, right, of the Amazons. And then Torunn Thorsdóttir is the princess of the Asgardians, right? So we send them. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Diana's the ambassador of peace. Of course, she would want to bring about peace in the Middle East. I think that she would be like I kind of think of we've all probably seen the bumper sticker that says coexist. You know what I mean? In a way that reminds me of Wonder Woman. Every superhero is going to have their own motivation and their own unique thing. I think that would kind of be her thing, right? Um, but so she goes there, and this is where Jake's familiarity of things um really struck me. No, no pun intended. He was like, I don't think you guys realize what would happen if Marvel's Asgardians went to Gaza. And it's maybe some of you now see where this is going. Um, and I was like, what are you talking about? And so again, he excels at here's the verse, here's, da 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 da. And so it turns out that because the Asgardians are perceived as gods, I don't think pagan gods is the right terminology. It's not the terminology he used. You get the gist though, right? Hopefully you get the idea. Forget about the specific words. Just you get the concept though, right? That a lot of people would be really angry at them just being there. So so fighting breaks out. It's the roll initiative moment in the adventure. And so two interesting things happened. Well, hold on. Let me tell another quick story quick. Um Diana used to date Dagda. And we've talked about Dagda a bunch on this channel. He was created by a group of aliens called the Old Ones. They had abducted a caveman, took his DNA, altered it, and created this genetically engineered race called the Eldar that were created to fight this massive space war, right? One of those guys was Dagda. He ends up on Earth in ancient Ireland where the local people were like worshiping him and stuff, and he didn't ask for that. It was just that they could not understand the concept of aliens and other planets and so on and so forth. Um, Arthur C. Clarke famously has his quote, you've probably all heard it, that any sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic, right? I'm probably misquoting it slightly, but you get the gist. So that was the case with Dagda and the other members of the Tuatha De Danann. We were saying they were all just genetically engineered people made in space. But he found his way eventually after the fall of the Tuatha De Danann. He found his way to Paradise Island where he encountered Diana, and they were lovers for a very, very long time. And then eventually they found their way to Rome, to the Colosseum where Hercules was, and Hercules was one of the Eternals. And the Eternals have a very, very similar origin story to Dagda, right? But the difference there was the Amazons had been worshiping the Eternals in our game world. So when Diana finds out about that, like it broke her because when in DC they would say that the Amazons were communing with Athena, in our game, because we're trying to blend ideas from DC and Marvel together into one cohesive world, we said that was Athena of the Eternals, right? So Diana was really, really opposed to the Eternals then, and then she had to shift her focus to Dagda, who she was in love with, and she felt like betrayed, and she felt brokenhearted, and just so on and so forth, right? And that is covered in great detail in other videos on the channel, so check those out if you haven't. But so in this moment, the point is that Diana, when people are reacting to the Asgardians, um, she gets it. Like she's been there, basically. You know what I mean? So she has a lot of empathy. And but it's been for her, it's been so long since ancient Rome and the Colosseum and all that stuff. Diana, by the way, in our game was born around 550 BC, which we got from the Linda Carter TV show. We rip off a lot of stuff from the Linda Carter version. So point being, she doesn't feel that way anymore, right? And so she wants to use this I don't know if you call it common ground or what, when she's dealing with everybody about this subject. And so missiles come in, and all of the players, it's kind of similar how we were like, how do we stop a hurricane? When the missiles come in, everybody's like, oh yeah, like I've never really seen Wonder Woman have to deal with that. Like, um, usually it's bullets, right? But if she blocks the missile with the bracelet and it explodes, it's going to do area effect damage. And she's going to take damage, right? And it's like Diana has a strength of 45 in first edition DC Heroes, but she does not have a body of 45. Her body is way, way lower. That's why she has to block with the bracelets, which I want to say has a body of 30. I don't have it in front of me. It's something like that, but it's higher than the bracelet has a higher body than her actual body does, is the point. Thus, deflecting bullets, right? So we're like, man, that's a problem for her to have to deflect a missile. So the Asgardians all have hammers. And then that's another one of these moments where people are going to, why do they all have hammers? We did an adventure where, of course, the original Super Skrull had the powers of the Fantastic Four. He fought them. He could do everything that all four of them could do. Then we introduced a second Super Skrull who had powers of four different Avengers, right? So he had like the strength of Hulk and so on and so forth. And then on top of that, he wore the Iron Man armor. And on top of all that, he had a replica of Thor's hammer. And so in our game world, the Asgardians got a hold of that and figured out how to reproduce that Skrull technology. So all the Asgardian women have copies of Thor's hammer now, right? So they are shooting the missiles with lightning while they're in the air, detonating them. Because we talked about doing a thing with the lasso, and we decided the lasso itself would not be fast enough. So we thought the lightning bolt would be faster and would actually be able to take out missiles. And then on the ground, we had ground troops that were actually using bullets. And so then this is where the Amazons are using the bracelets, right? So we had this nice moment where the way it used to be was there was a time when the Amazons and the Asgardians would have hated each other, right? And then now they're working together. They're saving each other's lives. So it was kind of neat. And it fit into that theme of people coming together, unity, peace, you know what I mean? So I really liked that. I thought that was really cool. Um, After that, Wonder Woman talks to the leaders of each side. In both cases, we had her make a charisma roll, and in both cases, she did not roll high enough to change anybody's mind. So that was really the reason she went there. I mean, there's two reasons she went there. One is peace, obviously. The other was to get away from the hurricane that was going to hit Avalon, right? So, um, but yeah, so that part of the mission was a failure. And so they end up leaving. And so then we get to the epilogue of the adventure. And the epilogue is all about Lara Kent. Because now this is the first real time we've ever seen her actually lead, and the fact that she's running for president means a demonstration of leadership is kind of nice, right? So the way she deals with the hurricane is she flies around it in circles. And I got to play her. My wife played Wonder Woman in this one. I played Lara. Um, so the solution was to fly around it in circles, but then to tighten the circle. And so every time you do a lap, you're just coming a little closer than before, right? And you bring all of that into the center, and it created a water spout, which Lara then froze with super breath and then busted it. So all the chunks fall into the water. There's no more wind, and the small chunks of ice are just going to melt at a normal rate, and so on and so forth. So when she comes back to land, everybody's happy with her, you know what I mean? And so again, this is kind of the first time we're seeing, how do I want to word it? Like there were two sides of her before, right? Where there was stuff she did, when she was wearing the glasses and the business suit and stuff like that. And then there's the stuff she did in spandex and a cape, and you know what I mean? And now we're seeing sort of that she is unified. She is kind of like a whole person for sort of the first time ever. You know what I mean? So that was cool too. Like that theme was all through the adventure then. So I thought it was really cool. I really liked this adventure a lot. I hope that you guys enjoyed hearing about it. Thanks especially to Jake for running this. Hopefully you're listening to this, Jake. If I get anything wrong, feel free to correct me, by the way. I tried not to get too specific into Middle Eastern terminology or whatever, because I know I'm going to goof up the terms. So hopefully I did a good job. At any rate, though, that was the adventure. We hope you liked it. If you did, as always, we would love it if you took a quick second to support the channel by hitting that like button, making sure you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you. And finally, leave us a comment. Let us know, have you ever had your characters try to stop a hurricane or a natural disaster? Have your characters in your games ever delved into the world of politics? Let me know. I'd be curious to hear about it. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.